The early 1960s were marked by stark contrasts and rapid changes. The Second World War had ended just 15 years earlier, but the scars were still fresh. A new struggle arose, a clash of ideologies between the capitalist West and the communist East. Both countries possessed nuclear weapons, creating a constant state of fear and uncertainty. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba became a focal point in the Cold War, drawing intense scrutiny from the United States. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the corrupt regime of Fulgencio Batista, promising a new era for Cuba. Relations quickly soured as Castro embraced communism and aligned with the Soviet Union. The Eisenhower administration began exploring ways to remove Castro, fearing the spread of communism. These plans were inherited by President John F. Kennedy in 1961. One plan called for an invasion by Cuban exiles to incite a rebellion. The hope was to spark an uprising against Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion took place in April 1961. It was a disaster from the start, plagued by poor planning. The exile force was poorly trained and equipped. The promised air support never materialized. Facing fierce resistance, the invasion collapsed within 72 hours, ending in a humiliating defeat for the American-backed rebels. The Bay of Pigs fiasco was a major setback for the Kennedy administration, showcasing vulnerabilities in American foreign policy. It emboldened Castro and pushed Cuba further into the arms of the Soviet Union. The alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union grew stronger, posing a significant threat to U.S. interests. Kennedy authorized Operation Mongoose, a covert program aimed at sabotaging the Cuban economy and ultimately assassinating Castro. The CIA's activities included economic sabotage and propaganda to destabilize Castro's government. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union sought to increase its influence in the Western Hemisphere. Khrushchev saw Cuba as a chance to challenge the United States directly. By placing Soviet missiles in Cuba, Khrushchev aimed to shift the balance of power in the Cold War. In the summer of 1962, secret negotiations solidified their military alliance. An agreement was reached to deploy Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban soil, escalating Cold War tensions. These missiles could strike targets across the U.S., creating a sense of urgency and fear. In the summer of 1962, the Soviet Union began constructing missile launch sites in Cuba. Soviet ships, laden with missiles and military equipment, crossed the Atlantic under secrecy. Operation Anadir aimed to deceive American intelligence. Equipment was disassembled and transported in crates marked as agricultural supply. American intelligence began to detect Soviet activity in Cuba. U-2 spy planes captured photographs of suspicious activity. Experts identified Soviet missile launch sites under construction. On October 14, 1962, Major Richard Heiser flew over western Cuba. His photographs confirmed Soviet missile installations in Cuba. The discovery plunged the world into its most dangerous crisis since World War II. The world held its breath for 13 days. During this period, the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union reached unprecedented levels. Leaders on both sides faced immense pressure, knowing that any misstep could lead to catastrophic consequences. It was a time of intense negotiations, secret communications, and high-stakes decisions. The fate of the world hung in the balance. In a strategic move, President Kennedy chose to implement a quarantine instead of a blockade. This distinction was crucial, as a blockade is considered an act of war. By opting for a quarantine, Kennedy aimed to avoid escalating the situation further. The goal was to prevent any more Soviet missiles from reaching Cuba, while still leaving room for diplomatic resolution. This decision showcased the delicate balance between showing strength and seeking peace. After days of intense negotiations, a breakthrough was finally achieved. Both superpowers agreed to a mutual de-escalation. The Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba, while the United States secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the most dramatic and perilous moments in modern history. It was a stark reminder of the devastating power of nuclear weapons and the importance of diplomacy. Though the world came perilously close to disaster, the crisis ultimately underscored the necessity of communication and compromise in the nuclear age.